What is the role of religion in our ever-changing world? From the News Channel 5 Network, this is Issues of Faith.
Hello everyone, welcome to Issues of Faith. Good show today. We're talking about a new children's story Bible. How difficult is it to write one of these? Many attempt it, and it's a difficult proposition. Happy to have with us Vanderbilt adjunct professor Elizabeth Caldwell, who has just written Growing in God's Love, a Story Bible. This is for children 5 to 8 years old. Thank you for being with us.
Glad to be here.
So how hard is it to write a story Bible?
Well, it involves lots of things. And unlike writing just a book for adults, you have this whole thing of illustrations, and then you have stories, and which stories do you select from the Bible? And that's kind of driven by an age group. So this one is written for 5 to 8 year olds. So you know that there are some stories you must include that every Bible storybook for children has. Like, you can't do a Bible storybook and not have, for example, Genesis or Noah, or some of the great figures, you know, like David and Moses. You've got to do those, but it's also important to add in some of the women like Esther and Naomi and Ruth. And then, of course, when you get to the New Testament, you always want to include the birth stories, and then the, the death stories, and the post-resurrection stories, and the stories of the early church. So you make some decisions about which stories to include and which not. So that's one of the challenges of writing it.
And you reviewed a number of these.
Yes.
There's several out there.
Yes.
And you reviewed a number. Yeah. And what did you find as you were looking at them?
Sure. As we think about the demise of bricks and mortar bookstores and the whole thing of books, one of the areas that's really been very alive are children's books, and particularly Bible story books. New ones come out every year. So when I started looking and reviewing at them, all of them, about 25 I looked at, I found some very traditional approaches. They just take a story from either the King James, the New Revised Standard version of the Bible, or perhaps the Common English Bible, and retell a story. And oftentimes these stories get retold in the very same ways. And so some of the new scholarship that biblical scholars are working on, publishing on, giving to our adults never get down to the level of children. So one of the things we wanted in this Bible story book was to look at some of these stories in some new ways.
And so how would this that you have written, Growing in God's Love, how would it be different than many of the others that you reviewed and that are out there?
Okay, a couple of ways, maybe 3 ways. One is most Bible storybooks for children are in a canonical order, meaning they start with Genesis and they move through the books of the Old Testament, and then they start in Matthew with the Gospels and they move through. And they make their selection. Do we include the letters, for example, the Pauline or the pseudo-Pauline letters, or which ones do we include? This book doesn't go particularly in canonical order. It is organized by themes. So there's a theme of beginnings, the beginnings of the world. So that gets the creation stories and the flood stories with Noah. It moves into a theme of strong women and strong men. We want little boys and girls to grow up hearing the stories of women as well as men. And oftentimes in storybooks you get so many fewer stories about the women than you do about the men. So the order is a bit different. Also, there's some summary stories at the end of the Old Testament. Children are curious and they ask questions. Where does God live? What does God look like? So we've got some stories. What is God's name? Where does God live? And that's very different. No Bible storybook has really done that. Secondly, we've got some new scholarship. So the Tower of Babel story in Genesis 11, 1-9, which everybody knows and sees a very big tower.
Right.
And kids remember that tower. Well, really the text says that they were building a tower and a city. And the translation goes, which was also the interpretation, they built a tower out of pride because they wanted to get close to God. Well, that's really a mistranslation. And our newer translation in Common English Bible describes it as they built a tower and a city because they wanted to stay together. They liked being together. They liked that everybody was alike. but God had a bigger plan. God wanted them and scattered them because God had a bigger plan that they would learn how to live with all the beautiful difference and diversity in the Bible. So that's the second thing that's distinctive about this. And then thirdly, illustrations. We wanted a variety of artists.
And you said you're at Vanderbilt Divinity School now. Many times you felt like it wasn't until people would go to seminary. In other words, they're getting a lot of education before they hear some of the nuanced nature of some of the stories. They really kind of dig deeper. And you're saying, let's give it to the kids.
Yeah, exactly. Like, there are 2 stories of creation. If you read them as an adult, you realize, wow, these are 2 very different stories. And the first one, it's day by day, you know, day 1, day 2, all the way up to day 7. And then in the second story of creation, you learn about Adam being created first and then Eve. And how do you come? Well, those are 2 stories written by 2 different authors. So it makes sense that they're different. But why conflate them? And that's one of the errors that a lot of Bible story books will do. They will conflate a story. Or, for example, the birth story of Jesus in 2 Gospels, Matthew and Luke. And in one gospel, they're magi, and in one gospel, they're shepherds, but they're not in the same gospel. And so oftentimes they will conflate and make this one big story. Also, you know, when the magi visit, Jesus is not a baby anymore. He's more like 2 years old. So these kinds of biblical scholarship that we wanted to pass on to children so they don't have to unlearn things later.
Because many people, they don't go to seminary. So they don't unlearn it. It's kind of the way they see it. And so then how do you handle in this book the story of creation, which that's very interesting. Yeah, there are 2 stories. And I would say both are from the Bible, and I guess I'm right.
Yeah, well, like the first story, we used, the first story is entitled How God Made Everything. So it really is about the creation of everything, the air and the water, and it's really the kind of the theme is how beautiful it is. And if God created it as beautiful, isn't it our job to keep it beautiful? So underlying a story is this little theme of our role as caretakers of the earth, which gets then to, if a kid wants to go that direction, you can talk about environment, you can talk about taking care of the earth, being good stewards. And in addition, every story has 3 questions: hear, see, and act. So it's kind of designed that you might sit at the end of the day with your child and read a story and then engage one of these questions. The second story of creation is called We Were All Farmers Once, because really it talks about being created out of the best of the earth, the topsoil. We're not created out of dust, we're created out of the very best, the topsoil. And the questions then talk about farming and land, and where does our food come from? So trying to connect a child to the things that they know, that keep this biblical story, this very old story, very alive.
Right, very alive. Keep it very alive, and I don't want to say pertinent, but in a way to communicate it to this generation. And then, all right, so how then do you treat the different stories of Jesus' birth?
Of Jesus' birth? Well, we have. It's really important when you do the Jesus birth story to get in all of the pieces of it. So there's the announcement to Mary. There's the visit, and this is if you're looking for stories that include women, this is where you start, because there are just so many wonderful ones. So Mary visits her cousin Elizabeth, who's also pregnant with John, who then becomes John the baptizer. So you've got then Mary and Elizabeth's story. You've got the story of Anna and Simeon later, after Jesus is born, the prophet Anna in the temple. You've got then the journey, the traditional journey to seeking a place for the child to be born. Then you've got the shepherds and the magi coming. So you've got a collection of 6 or 7 stories that are told in pieces, so that a child can then see the development of the story, kind of like very small chapters. Very small chapters, so it's a digestible sort of thing for each. Yes. Okay, all right, we're going to take a break, then I want to come back and talk about some of the illustrations, and then again, some of the parables or stories that are in here that might not be in the others, and just kind of go through that, because it's a fascinating decision how you come to that. We'll take a break. Be back right after this.